Talking about what I've learned really over the last 2 years being, I lead the Gender Special Initiative as a part of the Next Gen Cassava project. So I have come to understand gender and how it implicates in plant breeding. So I thought I'd share that with the department so we can all learn a bit more about this. To give you a brief outline, we'll have a crash course in the lingo history of gender, very, very quick. We can't do it justice in a short period of time. Then I'll talk about gender and plant breeding, some analysis tools, a case study in cassava, and some issues in a summary. So first things first, getting the lingo straight. There's a lot of lingo in gender studies. The first is the difference between sex and gender. Sex is really a biologically defined difference between males and females. It doesn't really relate to one another, so a male is a male regardless if a female is a female, and the definition is the same around the world. A male is a male everywhere in the world. Gender, on the other hand, is really a socially defined category, roles and responsibilities that men and women take on in different parts of the world. The definition is really relational, so a definition of a gender role of a man really relates to the gender role of a woman, so they play off one another. And also the definitions of what it means to be a man can be very different in Ithaca than what it is to be a man in Delhi. So the definitions are really social-culturally defined. Other basic lingos or gender roles are really what is acceptable if you're a man or a woman in certain parts of the world. What are the behaviors? What are the responsibilities that are acceptable? Gender relations are the relationships, like we said, between men and women in different parts of the world. Again, very much shaped by social beliefs and institutions. And really relevant here is gender-responsive research, is really reacting to these differences. So what are the different gender roles and responsibilities? And how can we make research more, not only meeting these demands, but actually helping to change the way things are? So that's the 2-slide lingo background. And now I'm going to give a very short history in gender and international development, because I think it's really relevant to know what has happened in the past to shape what's going to happen in the future, hopefully. So really, the first mention of women or gender and international development happened around the 70s, with Esther Bostrup's writings on women being portrayed as these kind of subsistence farmers being left in the old style of farming, while men are kind of up and running with modern techniques and market-oriented farming. So then what usually the UN pushed this really was, how can we really focus on women? How can we bring women back into the picture? They've been discriminated against in international development. How can we cater better to their needs? So UN declared the Decade of Women in 1975, and then there was a lot of targeted interventions that really focused on women specifically. But what that happens is, what the critics really say is, that helped to further marginalize women. Because if you only focus on women and not think about their context or the men that they relate to, it doesn't really help anyone. So there was a bit more thought going into this whole debate in the 80s and the 90s, which is called the Gender and Development, or GAD era. At this point, there was really more focus on how can we challenge how things are, and how can we empower women and not just target them for interventions? How do we make their voices heard more? And in 1995, there was the World Conference on Women in Beijing, very influential, and a task force that came out of that was driving a lot of the thinking at the time. And it is also at this time, you probably hear of gender mainstreaming a lot. That was born, really, in this gender and development era. So really looking at all aspects of program design, not just targeting at the very end of your technology, let's say women, but how do you think about it throughout the whole research process? How about now? I mean, it's hard to say that we're in a certain era, but things are changing slowly. So there's more talk right now, for instance, on gender and value chains, gender and assets. There are different frameworks that are coming out, continuing. Especially for agricultural development and agricultural research, there's huge donor pressure. If any of you have applied to any grants recently, there'll be a section that says gender impacts. So there's real donor pressure now to think about gender more, and even in agricultural research. And yet, there's still very little gender disaggregated data collection, and resources are very little. Yet still, a lot of projects define and say, we will serve women, they'll be the primary beneficiaries, we'll engage them, but it's still an add-on, it's an afterthought. It's just a part of the proposal, it's not thought throughout. And this year is really a stock-taking exercise because in 1995, the World Conference on Women, it's the 20th anniversary this year. So you'll see a lot of papers coming out saying Beijing plus 20, how are we going to bring women into international development? So the debate really continues. And the Millennium Development Goals are kind of expiring this year, so it's stock-taking exercises around equity. So I also thought I'd give, because I learned these and I thought they were quite interesting, general discourse and analysis frameworks in gender analysis. So how do people look at gender and how do they analyze gender in their projects? By far the most used, I would say, is the Harvard framework. It's very simple. You look at sex disaggregation, you say who does what, who's responsible for what, who has access and control of resources, and who benefits. And this could be for a development project, this could be for a research project. And really, it's used widely in gender planning and agriculture. You'll see this one a lot. I guess the second most used is the Moser framework, where a little bit more definition is brought in. So it's not as simple as just saying men and women. It's not binary, right? So she really suggests that we need to look at strategic and practical gender needs. Practical gender needs are food, shelter, where strategic are empowerment, really fighting against the system in a way. And she also brought this notion of women's triple role. So women are active not only in production, agricultural production, but also reproductory roles. For instance, caring for children, caring for the elderly, taking care of the home, and also community roles. So they're really burdened with different roles. And at this, under this framework, there's also interest in having women acting individually and collectively for their own interest. A lesser used framework is what's called the Women's Empowerment Framework by Longway. And she really focused on how do we empower women to make their own choices and participate in research how they choose, or development as they choose. And she talks about hierarchies of equality. So it's not enough to be equal at the welfare level, so having both men and women have shelter. It's really important that they go all the way up to having control over resources, control over their own lives. So she's saying we're really focusing on this downstream here, but we need to be thinking about more strategic empowerment. So, crash course in history and theory. And the last part, I would say, and the most complicated part, is Naila Kabir. She defined gender as a relationship. She's saying it's a relationship of power. It's not about how men and women relate to one another, but it's a power differential. It's much more complicated to think about and also to plan in your programs, but it's a really useful analysis framework. And she's saying if we want to change anything, we have to challenge the governance structures. So what does this look like, especially for agricultural research? It's all this language and theory. How does it apply to agricultural research? I think the most salient example is the CG, because they've been along for a long time. They've also had a lot of these thinkings going through their system over the years. And they've manifested in different ways, and it's very well documented how the CG has changed over the years. So initially in the farming systems approaches that were popular in the 60s and 70s, the CG really focused on gender as just an analytical category. They realized that women, being women, they had different needs. So they realized that if they started capturing that a bit better, they could design their research more effectively. So at this point, you see some sex disaggregated roles papers and also research papers. And kind of in parallel with what was happening with the gender and development era in the 80s and the 90s, the CG also shifted into more a participatory framework. So they decided it's not enough just to think about farmers, we need to work with them. So there was a focus really on engaging farmers in research. And the gender piece really came in as a key component of that because, again, they realized that women are a really key recipient of research. And it was really systemicized across the CG system. And it resulted in this PRGA. You may see documents from the PRGA. It's called the Participatory Research and Gender Analysis Unit within the CG. In 2009, the PRGA ended with a huge restructuring in 2010 of the CG. So what happened during the restructuring was they decided we don't need dedicated gender units. We need gender systemicized across all of our activities. And if you were here for Graham Thiele's talk in September, he talked about gender being a cross-cutting component in all programs. And you see a bit of a shift as well in the language. You see talk of gender norms and roles and how to challenge them. So it's really shifting more to the CGIAR framework of relationships and gender relations and empowerment. So there is change. So at this point, you're probably asking, this is a plant breeding seminar. What is she going on about? What does this have to do with plant breeding, if at all? Well, the CG is obviously has to do with the plant breeding. But what does it mean for us? There's a great paper by Catherine Farmworth and Janice Jiggins in 2003, where they look at plant breeding cycles, plant breeding research, and how gender analysis can be included in plant breeding systems. We don't have time to go through all the aspects, but you see the stages in the breeding cycle that they outline. So I'm just going to focus on setting goals, because that's a pretty easy thing to work on initially. So how do we set goals in a breeding program, keeping gender in mind? A lot of the literature really talks about priority setting. You know, to really take stock and think about whose needs are really met by the breeding that we're doing. And how can we inform that from different gender groups? Are we meeting all our end users' needs and demands? And I like this quote here too. Who determines which genetic qualities are valued in which markets for which purpose? Who decides what the priorities are, the breeding priorities? And another really cool, I think, in the literature concept is this more complex target environment. How can we move beyond the natural environment and start thinking about socioeconomic perspectives? And if you were here last year, I think Bettina Hausmann gave a really nice CFAD seminar where she talked about G times E times C, and C is the context. So how do you bring the socioeconomic context when you're defining your priorities and your target environments? So some reflective questions you could think about. For instance, are different gender groups really relate to the food production system in different ways? Their roles and responsibilities mean that they have different needs. How do these manifest? How do their roles drive these differences, and what are these differences? Secondly, you could think about access. Access to planting material, access to input. So if we have a variety that's developed and going through the kind of formal seed systems, generally women don't have so much access to formal seed systems. So it's never really going to reach the poor women that don't have access to those systems. And if you have a variety that's input responsive, for instance, who has access to inputs? Generally, men have more access to inputs. So are we disadvantaging women? And labor loads. There's a lot of examples of inappropriate varieties that take longer to cook or harder to pound. And those roles, especially processing and cooking roles, are more important for women. So how are we affecting the labor load for these women? These are just some questions. You could go on about this for a while. So you're probably thinking, are there really gendered preferences? I mean, that seems really simplistic. But farmers are not an amorphously defined category. There's a lot of differences amongst farmers, even within regions or even within one village. But I just set out some clear examples which I thought were pretty interesting. A lot of them are from the 90s and the participatory time, actually. Eva Welson looked at pearl millet in India, and she found that because women usually did a lot of the harvesting by hand for pearl millet, they were looking for ease of hand harvesting, for instance, as a criteria, as an important trait, if they're looking to improve pearl millet. Whereas on the man's criteria, that didn't even appear, because that's not their role. Thelma Paris did a lot of work with Erie in India and in Indonesia, and she found that women's preferences really follow their roles. A lot of women are in charge of livestock feeding, so when they wanted a new rice variety, they wanted more biomass, so they could feed more biomass to their cattle. They were also in charge of husking and threshing and food preparation, so those traits were specifically important to them. Louise Sperling has published a lot on this, especially in the 90s, around bean breeding in Rwanda. And she actually had a very nice system where she engaged specialist bean breeders who were women. These were farmers, women, who were really more knowledgeable about beans than their peers. So they were chosen specialist bean breeders, she called them. And she ran a breeding program over about 4 or 5 years where she improved bean varieties along together with these women. And she found that not only were they more productive at the end, the varieties that came out, but they had wider dissemination because those women probably knew more about what their peers needed than her. So it was a really interesting process. Same for Simit in Zambia. they found that this relates to seed systems. Women preferred open pollinating varieties that don't require inputs, because this is what they could access. These are the type of materials they could access. Whereas men preferred the high-yielding hybrids because they could buy them in the markets. They had access to the hybrids. Jackie Ashby did tons of work in Colombia around beans, and she found that women, when they rank varieties, this was just 1 to 5 ranking, they chose varieties that were based on their cooking qualities, and they selected against varieties that didn't have good taste, for instance. Again, it comes down to the gender roles. And this is really interesting about cassava in Malawi. Lindley Carlton Chinoa looked at vulnerable groups. These were widows, single women, and also lower status males. Often chose to grow bitter cassava varieties because those varieties were not subject to theft. There's a lot of food thieves who would come through and take disadvantaged people's cassava crop because they felt they could. But if you grew a bitter cassava variety, it wasn't stolen so readily because it's hard to process. So it's kind of a resilience strategy that communities employ. So that seems a bit simplistic, right? And it is. It's not that simple. You can't just look at men and women across different domains. And new technologies can drive change. For instance, there's a case in Malawi where women really preferred dent maize because it was easier to grind and process for cooking, where men preferred flint maize for storability. But if grinding mills were introduced or available in the area, that difference kind of disappeared because women could access the grinding mills. They didn't need to grind anymore. Wealth is a huge differential. So even within women, a wealthier woman may have different preferences than a poor woman. So within categories, we need to think as well. And locality, I like this quote from Farnworth again, where they say, if there's a poor woman in an urban community that's selling puffed rice as a snack, would she have the same preferences as someone who's just cooking rice every evening? So where you are matters as well. So how do you get to this type of information? There's a wealth of tools out there. I put a bunch up here, and I could forward them to you if you're interested. But these 2 key references, I think, are really important. And I can forward the references again. So the first step is really taking stock. What's the situational analysis? And this really means what is being grown, if you're thinking of a certain community or a certain crop. How are they used? What are the users' preferences? What are the available resources? And how can you increase income generation? What are the barriers to change? Some important issues are looking at the agroecology, looking at the socioeconomic conditions, the markets that exist, how the process of change is, and what are the limitations of the farming system. And specifics, varietal needs and preferences of target groups. That's what we saw a minute ago. That's the kind of data that those studies produce. And always remembering to collect data on sex, age, wealth, religion, ethnicity. All these variables that can explain preferences because of their roles. And again, there's a laundry list of tools. There's a 200-page book on this. You could choose any tool you want. So we won't go over all of them, but just to say these could be just any social science analysis tools, but they could also be used in breeding. Some examples I think really interesting are, for instance, scoring exercises. You give respondents voting cards, and they can vote for traits, how important different traits are. They put their vote on different traits. Or you could use varieties and say, is this variety good for this trait? And it's voted for. So you can really get a sense of how your respondents perceive the importance of traits and the varieties. You could look at the consensus in certain groups, different gendered groups, and say, what is your ideal variety? Please describe your ideal variety. And the group has to come to a consensus. So it's kind of an interesting experience. There's these shopping scenarios, which are quite interesting as well, where you have respondents select from artificial, let's say, seed shops or demonstration plots, which seeds or which varieties they would buy if they were in a shop. So it's kind of giving them incentive and saying, if you had the choice, which one of these would you choose? There's a lot of ranking publications where varieties are ranked, traits are ranked. There's pairwise ranking, more complex ranking. And also you can do trait panels. There's some evidence of like different bean varieties that vary in plant height, for instance, that are taken to the community, and then it's asked which one of these heights is more suitable for your system. So you can have panels of traits. And just to leave this up there, I won't go over this one by one, but it is a very key question of who actually does this work. Because not any of us can do all of that. It's a certain skill to do social science research, and we can't expect everyone to do that. So who do you partner with? And again, in Farnworth and Jiggins, there's a nice list of different partners and the pros and cons. So a case study, what does this look like in reality? I'll give you an example from Next Gen Cassava, because that's, I guess, closest to my heart, and that's what I've been involved in. So I'm going to quote Jean-Luc here and embarrass him. We were talking with him, with Graham Thiele, about how are these accelerated breeding cycles affecting women? Or is there a gender impact of these accelerated breeding cycles? It was kind of a theoretical conversation. And Jean-Luc said, these breeding cycles help you get where you want to go faster, but where are we going? How can we make sure that the work we're doing is gender responsive? And just question where we're going. For instance, are the traits we're selecting for negatively correlated with women's preferences especially? Are we paying less attention to cooking and processing traits? Especially for cassava in Nigeria, this is huge. Women pretty much dominate the processing domain around cassava in Nigeria. And yet we're really not measuring any of those traits because they're just too difficult. You have to spend hours and hours processing thousands of lines. So are we really marginalizing women's preferences at that point? Can we increase our understanding and ability to phenotype for these harder traits that are really important for women? These are the kind of key questions. So how do you go about doing this? It's kind of a painful consensus building exercise is the answer. So you spend hours in meeting rooms with breeders and social scientists and gender experts to come up with a tool. How do you examine this in the communities? And then you come up with a consensus tool and test it, retest it, pilot it, repilot it. It's quite an iterative exercise. And you do some scoping studies and talk to key informants about what could be important and how that feeds into your survey. So I'm just going to talk about the pilot study that we did. By no means is the bigger study, but that we focused on sex disaggregated focus group discussions around 4 categories, and also individual semi-quantitative interviews with men and women separately. So it's a 19-page document, the tool. I won't talk about it all, but just snapshots of what we were seeing. For instance, in the focus group discussions, when you talk about variety description, so you ask the group to describe which cassava varieties they grow. Here's the list along the left, and then you say, can you describe it? So it's described really in the community's own words. And then you ask, what are the main uses? So this is captured, for instance, on a giant flip chart in the discussion room. And then this is a part of the individual survey, just one part of it, where we're talking about specific cassava varieties that individual is growing in their fields. So again, you say, how many cassava varieties do you grow? What are their names? What percentage is planted? Is it improved? How long have you been growing it? What is the main use? And here's the most interesting part. You ask, what major trait do you like most about this variety? And you'll see different answers to the different varieties. This is an example of one respondent. So you kind of start getting trait panels, let's say, for different gender groups. You get an understanding of what key traits are important in which varieties for which groups. And the second half of the individual interview is really open-ended. So you start talking about more difficult subjects, decision-making, for instance. Because it's not enough to understand what people do, but what are their constraints? Can a woman decide where to plant her cassava, when to harvest it, when to sell it, and does she keep that income? These are very tricky questions, but really key to designing your intervention. So again, this is just one snapshot of what we're asking the respondents. And we try to think about change as well. How has this changed in the last 10 years? How is this going to change in the next 5 years? What do you see as process of change in your community? So some examples of what we see very quickly is in the focus group discussions in Nigeria, for instance, you have the community or that focus group really vote with stones. So you say, these are the 3 varieties that you said you grow. How much do you grow of each? So then they say 8 stones, 6 stones, 4 stones, and why? So these are the actual respondents that were coming out of the focus group. So you can see fast maturing is important. For instance, this is a women's focus group. And even though, for instance, this variety matures late, it stores in the soil. So that's really important to those women. And in the trickier parts, when you're talking in the community about decision making, you say, can you decide when you harvest your cassava and what to sell it as? And in this focus group, for instance, the women were saying that they could. They had the power to decide when to harvest and what to sell. Some more quantitative data. This was done by Paula Iragaba, who's a PhD student here in plant breeding and genetics. And she did some more quantitative work in Uganda looking at I think it was one community and 4 parishes within that. One district, and 4 parishes. So again, she said she had men and women responding differently, the different traits that they themselves were saying were important. So these 5 key traits came out. And what you see, I think, is really interesting is these are 4 different parishes. And men and women may be similar within each parish, but across you have differences. So if you went and only asked this parish, you would get a very different picture of what the desired cassava is than if you went to this parish. So there's a really huge locality difference. And this kind of idea that women don't care about yield is not true. They care just as much as men about yield. But they may care more about long shelf life, for instance, or cooking qualities or taste. We took the same data and also disaggregated it by marital status, because this can also define, like we saw with the other cassava example, how people respond or how they grow and use cassava. And if you look at across married, single, or widow categories, you see that married men and women are pretty unanimous in what they want and look for. But if you go to the single men and women, they have very different needs. So I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that the reds are women and the blues are men. Very gender stereotypical. So men prefer more sweet taste, whereas women really care about yields. And if they're widows, it's kind of a similar process. So if you think about livelihood strategies for single and widow women, they may need to sell their cassava for income to survive. So that's maybe why they're really focusing on yields. So there may be explanatory factors behind why these results are coming out. So as a part of this work, what are the next steps? We want to dig a bit deeper. So we want to actually go to the farmers' fields and not just have interviews, but actually see the production systems and start asking what is grown where, genotype them, take DNA samples, and look at management practices. And also look at trait descriptions. How do men and women themselves describe yield? How do they describe plant height? What is the ideal idiotype for them, for their systems? And more importantly for processing, because this is especially important for women, how do people define high diameter content? You see this coming out a lot in the surveys. Well, how does a farmer know if a variety has high dry matter content? And usually people say they bite into it or they put their nail into it. How do we start standardizing that measurement or that understanding of something that we define very separately? And can we bring food technologists in to start linking the knowledge across these 2 different domains? So really codifying the local knowledge and descriptions of traits. What's called EMIC or ETIC knowledge. EMIC is knowledge that you know, that you use yourself, and ETIC knowledge is one that you see in other systems and you measure. So how can we link the farmer's own knowledge to something we can measure and take back to the breeding programs to start using in selection? For instance, we hear this a lot in the West Africa that gari that women make, they want it to rise or draw. What does that mean? A lot of you talk to food technologists and they say, well, I know what that is, that's starch content. You say, okay, do you know that for sure? Well, let's think about it a bit more. So can we define varieties, for instance, that are low swelling and get an index with the food processors saying swelling index of 1, whereas a variety is high swelling? Can we start standardizing and codifying that knowledge? So this is the kind of general framework that we're working in, is once we get a more of a sense of what's happening in these communities, can we improve our measurement tools and then maybe select on station for idiotypes that we think could be suitable for different communities. So we kind of get a snapshot and then we say we think this is what would suit those needs. Can we go back to those farmers, kind of establish a relationship, iterative, to say, is this what you're looking for? And if not, what can be improved? So when I usually talk to breeders about this, the first reactions I get are you kidding me? Am I going to do micro breeding for every single person in every single community? Fair enough. It's a lot of thinking. And if you think about it too much, it gets scary. And the second reaction usually is, I can't breed for everything. I've got my 3, 4 key traits. If I bring in these cooking traits, it's just going to dilute the effect. I'm not going to get any advances in any of the traits. And really from the more socioeconomic point of view is we're really inferring what we think needs are from what we observe. So we're really entrenching the situation in what it is. Are we taking a snapshot and breeding for what is now and missing out on what could be the future and change? And crops really don't exist in a bubble. So we need to understand systems, especially in smallholder farmers. We need to really contextualize what we're seeing. And we're really stuck on this Harvard model, like I said in the beginning. We're looking at males versus females and different roles and responsibilities, mainly because it's difficult to find a middle ground between social scientists and breeders, because what defines data is very different in those two different communities. So the Harvard model is really the middle ground that people come up with. And this idea that people describe this moving target point as, I didn't know I needed an iPhone until I had it. You know, how do farmers know what they need? You know, us breeders, we can come up with some new traits or some new variability that is not existing in the system, which is very true. But it could be that, can we think about what the impacts and limitations of those new interventions could be? So in summary, in defining targets, can we think more complex target environments and include some context? Can we examine our priorities and inform them with situational analysis? Can we think about trait trade-offs? Who benefits when you're prioritizing one trait over another? Can we increase participation? Kind of the participatory vein fell off the map. It's still ongoing in a lot of programs, but can we revitalize that? It was a very useful era, really. And we need to beware of oversimplification. The results I showed from our work, for instance, that's oversimplified. Can we dig a bit deeper? Which men, which women? And budgeting. I mean, these things are not cheap. And most projects don't have funding for it. So it just falls by the wayside, or if you need to cut funding, this is the first thing to go, right? So how can we fight for that funding? And also, what can we do here? I mean, we're a Department of Plant Breeding and Genetics, right? What is our gender situation? And I would like to think that maybe we need a module for plant breeding students just to sensitize on these issues and start to understand this. Can we cross-link with AWARE seminars a bit more to bring a more gender dimension into plant breeding? Can we think about a gender audit, a departmental gender audit? And can we have a gender help desk? I mean, I don't know everything, but I may know where to look. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to respond to them. Or any other ideas that pop to your head watching this. How you think we can really change our department and just be more gender responsive institutionally, at least. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and also our collaborators, especially at IITA, Holger Kirsch, who's the gender expert there that I work with very closely, and also the breeders. They've been fabulous in keeping an open mind and giving us a chance to think about something different. At NRCRI in Nigeria and NACRI in Uganda, again, the breeders that were participating, and also Makerere University, who helped co-supervise the student that did the work in Uganda, and the Next Gen project more broadly. So thank you.